Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of a recorded video interview where we're going to try to highlight the concept of value propositions, which you must have seen by now in the educational modules. But actually, we wanted to try and talk to a person within ArcelorMittal who's actually taking the learnings from that particular module and putting it into practice on a daily basis. So we're privileged to have one of your colleagues, Sergio Hemmesmeyer from ArcelorMittal Brazil, who actually is trying and is implementing value proposition concepts in his market, in his segments in Brazil. So Sergio, thank you so much for taking your time to share your learnings and how you're implementing value proposition concepts in Brazil.
Hi, Devan.
Yeah.
Good to talk to you.
Absolutely. Sergio, so one of the things, so I know that people talk about value propositions and stuff like that. Why do you think value propositions are important in your market?
I think it's a very important way to focus the efforts that you're doing. I mean, as everyone knows, not every customer demands the same thing. They require different things. And designing a proper value proposition is the way to really focus on what's important for that particular group of customers.
And when you were doing this exercise, when you actually did this exercise for your organization, did you find out that most of your customers only valued your products, or were you surprised to see that a significant part of your value proposition has actually got to do with the extra services that you have, like supply chain services, engineering services, and that also plays an important role?
That's true. We could see that a lot of services and the way you relate to your customers is quite important also. Of course, products is still a very important role, but services are also quite important.
Indeed. And in the segments where you're trying to implement your value propositions, right? To what extent do you think that services could be a key differentiator in your value proposition?
That's a good question. I think more and more the services are getting important into the value proposition because, as I said, products is always going to be important, but in a world where technologies shared with everyone, at a certain point, it's somehow easy for competitors to reach, if not all your product mix, but a good portion of your product mix. So the way to differentiate is relate better to your customer, provide other kinds of services to them in order that it eases their job too.
Indeed. And you started doing this exercise, which you want to share with us about how you went about developing your value proposition. But before that, if somebody had mentioned the term value proposition, what did it mean to you before you went into developing this value proposition?
I think it's, I mean, there are a lot of definitions for value proposition, but I think ultimately is what makes the customer buy from you and not from someone else. It seems even too simplistic, but behind this there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, first you have to understand what your competitor is delivering to your customer. You also have to really understand what you have to deliver, what are your capabilities, but most importantly, really understand what the customer needs, what they want, what makes a difference. Not only what they're saying that's important for them, but really understand what's important for them and what's going to drive their buying decisions.
And I love this because one of the things that we were discussing in the modules before was what are the key elements of a good value proposition, and what they must have read from the articles as well as from the training material is that you need to know about your customers. You need to know about your competition. You hit both of them. And you had said the third thing, which I think is important, which we just take it for granted, is the fact that do we have the capability to deliver on this differentiation point? Because it's easy to communicate where your value proposition is, but if you're not able to deliver on it, it's just an empty promise. Huh?
Exactly. I mean, if the previous step of this whole process was, let's say, targeting, where you choose the playing field, I think the value proposition is more like the choosing your weapons.
Yeah.
And you're not, I mean, you don't want to choose a weapon that you're not good at.
Yeah. I love this, because essentially what you're saying is that if I need to know my customers and if I need to know my capabilities, segmenting alone is not enough. I need to target better, because you can segment, and maybe that is a good segment for you. But if you don't have the tools necessary to be able to target that segment, then you will not be able to deliver on your promises. I think what I'm hearing between the lines you're saying is that segmentation is important, but deciding which segments you want to focus on and targeting the right customers is going to be critical for you to be able to develop your value proposition. Is that correct?
Sure.
And actually, so one of the things which I always have found interesting, and I don't know what your thoughts were, is when you started doing this research about what your customers want and what the competition is looking at, did you actually take a look within your own organization to see how much knowledge you actually have within your own company about what the customers want before you actually went and tested it out?
Yes, we did, and it's interesting how much knowledge there's, let's say, hidden in the heads of the people that are around you. People from not only people from sales, but people from customer technical services, from product development. At a certain level, each one of them has already had some kind of contact or interaction with the customer, with different people at the customer, and they all can bring something valuable to your value proposition.
Indeed. And one of the things that you and I discussed, and you actually had a PowerPoint where you showed me how you've actually gone through the process. And I think it would be valuable to our audience to actually see, they've actually seen the theory, right? They've seen me talk about it. I've asked them to read some materials, but maybe it'll be nice for them to actually see how one of their own colleagues has put this into action. So it'd be wonderful if you could actually share some of your ideas with your own colleagues. Huh?
Sure. I put just two slides here to share something that we are developing. That was just an example that we did, how we came up with the value proposition for construction, for instance. Yes. So the first step was the segmentation based on the customer activity, where you have automotive, construction, home appliances, machinery, and so on. And then the traditional way of doing the attractiveness and competitiveness matrix. And here the objective was actually to target the segments. After that, we came with the second level of what we call micro-segmentation, but not based on the customer activity anymore, but based on the customer value.
Yeah.
We try to group customers based on common things that they value. Just to show an example, we assessed a customer in 16 criteria, just to show here in technical, logistics, and commercial relationship, where we try to assess how much customer values product quality, co-engineering, plan management, downstream integration, lead time, planning flexibility, quotation time response, and so on. So based on this, we grouped customer into groups of similar interests or similar valued criteria with the objective of designing the value proposition. I mean, it only makes sense to design a value proposition, a group of initiatives that bring value to customers for customers that have common, that value common things.
Indeed. And why is that important? Because it's interesting, right? Because you say we want to group them so that you have a group of customers. Why do you think it is important for you to do that grouping as well?
I mean, it's always a matter of resources. I mean, you don't have the resources to treat all the customers individually.
Yeah.
Also, you want to treat them as better as you can.
Yeah.
So the point is that you group customers into how they behave similarly, so that you can design actions that fit better to their needs.
It's fantastic. So this is really great. So essentially what you're saying is that we need to take a look at the resources, because if we focus on everybody, then the resources might be too much. So you have to be smart about also using and saying, okay, if we can group them into buckets, we can be much more efficient. And as you said, in targeting those and allocating the adequate resources to be efficient as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then here, the next step is just highlighting the needs of each micro segment.
Yeah.
Here, I'm just showing an example of some segments that we came up in the construction.
Yeah.
For instance, one segment was a group of customers that would mostly value lead time, pricing predictability, and product quality.
Yeah.
Another segment, customers that value payment terms and planning flexibility. Another group of customers that would value order online, follow-up, co-engineering, and technical cooperation. And another segment that value product portfolio, a wide range of product portfolio, downstream integration, and timely quotation response.
And this is really nice. Essentially, as we were discussing earlier, this is just proof that a good product is fantastic, is a must. But what can differentiate you? Actually, yes, you cannot have a crappy product and then say, okay, I'm going to provide great services. But I think just having a good enough product right now is the Olympic minimum that they expect from you. And your ability to differentiate actually is going to be on some of these needs that you have identified. I think it's actually very interesting, because that's what the audience must have seen in their learning so far, is we say the value to a customer is a combination of your product and your service, plus of course the ArcelorMittal brand. But here you're clearly showing the concept of how the services are mixing together with the quality product as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And finally, is defining action plans so that we can deliver actions that fit the needs of these customers. So we have initiatives regarding developing mechanisms for pricing predictability, monitor product quality, designing perhaps planning flexibility tools, develop co-engineering with some particular customers, improving our website to improve the order follow-up, and so on. And of course, after developing the plans, it's quite important to have a proper follow-up and reporting. And this is something that we are, I can tell you, we are still at the beginning. We're not benchmarks on this, but we are trying to develop some tools like here to monitor the actions that we're doing for each of the segments with deadlines and responsibles. And, I mean, doing the proper homework.
Indeed. And I think that one of these times is that what we'll always do is that we'll share your contact details with your colleagues, so that if they want to contact you about how you're actually doing this more concretely over a longer period of time, that they can actually contact you. I'm assuming that should be okay with you.
Sure, no problem, of course.
So Sergio, now that you talk about this, a couple of things as well. One of the things you said was you had 16 criteria that you identified, right? 16 criteria. How did you go about identifying it? Did you go ask customers, or did you take a look at RFPs, RFQs, or did you talk to experts within your own organization about this, or a combination of all?
I think, as we talked before, we have a lot of knowledge in the people around you in the company. So having the moments to talk to them and try to understand what makes difference, what they have seen in the customers. With a special eye, try to identify what would be important for customers. It's already a great starting point.
Yeah.
But there are also tools in the marketing best practice that the booklets that we have designed by CCM and the experts group also provide a good starting point.
Indeed. And that's interesting. So because you talk about, do you actually end up See, because a lot of times you have knowledge in-house, but that's still at the end of the day is your perception, right? And you
Correct.
need to check it with customers. So did you actually have you or your own team go check some of the things that you came up with internally to make sure that it matches with exactly what the customers wanted?
Yes, I think, and this is again something that we're starting. And but one thing that we can see is actually how much are the customers using
Voila.
the services that we're offering. I mean, if we understood that the customer wants a particular payment condition or online services, we can check if after we have provided this to them, if they're actually using and how are they using. And then it's really going to the customer and talking to them and understanding why are they using, why are they not using, what could be improved, and so on. And this is a learning process. This is never ends.
And I love this because essentially what you're saying is just because we have a value proposition that we develop at one point in time, it is very naive to think that it's going to be the same value proposition for the rest of the lifetime of the customer. It's a continuous learning process.
Exactly. And I can tell you one thing that we really learned is that first, you never know enough. You're always going to learn something new, and there's always something to be changed in your current position.
Indeed. And the other thing which I wanted to ask you is, so one of the things you said earlier was we need to know our customers, we need to know, of course, what they value, we need to know what are our capabilities. The other thing you said was competition. So where did the idea about what the competition is doing factor into the value propositions and the segments that you have created so far based on that? You understand what I mean? Yeah.
I think you have to, when you design your value proposition, you have to keep on, of course, look at what the customer needs, but of course you need to have an eye on what the competition is doing also.
Yeah.
You don't want to provide a worse service. You don't want to fight your competitor in a, say, in a field where you know they're better than you.
Yeah.
I think designing a good value proposition is also choosing where you want to play.
Yeah, indeed. And what about this? So let's say, for example, let me play the devil's advocate. That is, the fact is, yes, you do not want to be worse than your competition, but sometimes you don't want to be so much better than your competition because the cost to serve is also going to go up. Am I making sense out here? If the customer does not value it, and if the competition is smart enough not to give it, do you want to provide a service which increases your cost to serve but might not be valued by the customer? So how do you take care of that?
I mean, of course, you always have to look at this, and you don't want to overserve your customer, right? And the key here is, again, understand what the customer really values.
Yeah.
If the customer really values something, then you should be able to get the proper reward for this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, makes sense. And I think that's also why you keep tracking and you keep measuring. I really love your value proposition monitoring tool. I'll be honest, in all my time that I've had a chance and taught and worked with companies, this is one of the first times I've actually seen a value proposition monitoring tool, which I think is very smart, because it also will make sure that you are always in line with what the needs of the customers are and what the competition is doing, because that will reflect in whether the customers use your value proposition or not. But it also will give you ideas for how to improve in the future as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So
we still have a long way to go.
Indeed. Well, but the fact is that, well, that's actually a good question, actually. That's one of the last questions I have about this is, how long did it take for you to come up with this stepwise approach, doing this segmentation based on the criteria that you came up with, creating this tool to monitor it as well? Because I'm sure what I see is a very simplified version, but I'm sure a lot of thought and time and blood and work went into this. So how long did it take for you to come up with this, you and your team?
I mean, actually, this tool didn't take so much, but getting to the point where we reached this, we've been dealing with this value proposition for more than 2 years already, and we've been improving with time and with a lot of discussion with the support from CCM and discussing internally.
Yeah,
it's been quite some time.
Absolutely. And are you getting the buy-in from the sales? Because most of the time, this is still something where you get input from the sales. But now the question is, once you've done it, from a marketing perspective, do you actually see it being deployed? And did your salespeople kind of are willing to go out there and then start practicing these kind of tools and presenting it to the customers?
Yes. I mean, as I said, we're at the beginning of this journey, with particularly this new tools. But for the time being, we see that if you really show the value for the people, they buy.
Indeed, and it goes two ways. Indeed, you need to show value to your salespeople to be able to take it and go to the customers, right? And I think indeed, and that's what I really like is the fact that it takes 2 years. And Sergio, just for the audience, so did you actually also go through this training program that CCM put through, or is it based on the books, or is it a combination of both that you've used to come up with this?
It's a combination of both.
Yeah, and I think
also the trainings from CCM, but there are a lot of materials available. Also, CCM has some initiatives with articles and webinars.
Indeed. And I think so. So essentially, this is not the first time we meet. So were you in the first or the second module that we ran this program with when we did it in Luxembourg?
I think was in the first.
Was Mr. be the second one then, or the first? So essentially, and that's what it is, right? Because we've been doing it for 4 years, and then when you start going in and then start putting up the resources together to make it happen, it also takes time, right? You need to go back, you need to digest what you've seen, and then you say, okay, why is this important? Then start finding the right tools to get all that information together, putting it into practice, testing the ideas, running it by your sales team, and now you're going towards monitoring. And I think that's really, really fascinating to actually see this in action. And I must say that the tool that you showed, the monitoring tool, I think will deserve a webinar by itself, where you can actually take them through how you went through designing that value proposition tool, which I think is a very smart way for you to go back and see if things are not working. If you're not making revenues or sales, you can go back and say, well, let's go take a look. Did we actually find something in our value proposition monitoring tool that should have alerted us to why we may not be seeing sales? Is that the overall plan moving forward?
Yes, and actually this is one of the most important challenges that we are facing this journey, let's say, is actually measuring the effects of the initiatives that we are proposing.
Absolutely.
It's key. It's very important that we are able to measure the effects that we are doing, but it's at the same time it's difficult, because you have to you want to measure the individual effect of those initiatives, and sometimes it's very hard to segregate the effects of the initiative and externalities.
Absolutely.
Something else.
But that's very interesting, right?
Prices and what happens with the competition.
Indeed.
Also, you don't want that your KPI, your measurement, is too costly. I mean, you want to have someone working to have a measurement 2 days to come up with a number.
Indeed.
It's always a trade-off.
But I like what you say as well. Is the fact is that yes, because what you're saying right now mixes together with your sales performance, your sales team's performance, because your sales team's performance might be reflective based on what your competition is doing. Your competition might decide to lower their price. You cannot do much. So you might have a strong value proposition, but if your value proposition monitoring tool says that it is still strong from the viewpoint of the customer, but if your salespeople are still losing the order, it's one of two things. Salespeople are not following up with the customers, or there is something happening in the market that is not necessarily captured either from the value proposition tool or from the salesperson activities. You see what I mean? Like say, for example, your value proposition is strong, your salespeople are doing the right things, but then you're going through a recession.
Right.
It means that your customers are going to say, hey, we love this. Your salespeople are doing the right things, but hey, I don't have the money to buy it.
Right.
And I think that's why having this value proposition tool, because if you can say your value proposition tool is correctly capturing the value, then you know that at least from everything else and designing the product and the service, you're doing the right things.
Mm-hmm.
And there are things happening that you cannot control. And that's pretty much, I think that's why having tools like these is actually going to help you understand what can be controllable within ArcelorMittal and what are beyond the control of ArcelorMittal.
Of course.
Indeed. Very smart. Well, Sergio, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your insights. And I'm sure that the participants will be reaching out to you to see how you've actually done it and look at templates. But again, it was an absolute pleasure, and I hope that we'll have a chance to talk again.
Sure, of course. Good talking to you.
Thank you very much, Sergio.